Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel where we talk all things finance and investing. Today's video, I'm going to talk about 2025 predictions for the S&P 500. The S&P 500 we talk about a lot on this channel because it's the broadest index and a lot of the big banks have been putting out their forecast for 2025 and we're going to go through it in detail today. At the end of the video, we'll recap a little bit with my thoughts on where I think the markets will go in 2025. So let's get into the video. Okay, 2024 was a fantastic year for the S&P 500, up around 30% year to date at the time of me filming this video, with dividends reinvested. That is an incredible return. And for the first time since the late 90s, we've had back-to-back 20% returns. Incredibly bullish, and it's very rare to get back-to-back 20% plus returns like we've just had. However, one thing to keep in mind, 2023 we had a 22% increase or so in the markets, was the first part of this back-to-back 20% returns. However, a lot of that was just recouping the bear market that we saw in 2022. So to me, it's not entirely surprising that we've had such strong runs in 2023 and 2024. And it's a little bit misleading to say back-to-back 20% plus gains being incredibly bullish. So bear that in mind. 2022, we saw a bear market. So a lot of that was just being recouped in 2023. 2024, of course, we've seen an extension of that with this 30% rise. Predicting the markets over the near term, 1 year or less, is incredibly difficult. So in all honesty, a lot of this is just a little bit more fun than anything else. It is interesting to see where the banks predict the markets will go for the next year, but keep in mind, it is notoriously difficult, if not impossible, to predict what the stock market will do in the next 12 months. But let's see what the banks are forecasting anyways for a bit of fun. So far, the major banks tend to be predicting anywhere from a 9 to 19% gain for 2025. This is still quite bullish on the back of the returns that we've seen so far in 2024. Bank of America is forecast around a 10% rise. Bank of Montreal Capital Markets, who tend to be on the bullish side, have forecasted an increase of 11% for the S&P 500. Goldman Sachs have forecast a 9% gain, which is really interesting because if you saw my recent video on their 10-year return prediction of only 3%, I was a little bit surprised to see them come in for a 9% gain in 2025. Deutsche Bank has forecast a 16% rise for next year. And Morgan & Stanley, who tend to be pretty bearish on their outlook for US equities based on valuations, have forecast an actual pretty big range, 6,500 to 7,400 depending on economic conditions. As part of that, though, they also said it's possible that we see a 28% correction in the S&P 500 next year. And Ed Yardeni, who does Ed Yardeni Research, pretty well-respected research house on Wall Street, I've decided to include him as well on this, and he's actually forecast S&P 500 return for next year of 19%. Very bullish indeed. He thinks it could get up to 7,000. So 19% gain for Yardeni Research. So what's driving some of this optimism that we've seen? Is it just the momentum of what we've seen in 2024 continuing? Well, there's a couple of things that's driving this bullishness. From a macro perspective, it tends to be around interest rates. We're still forecasting that interest rates are going to continue to come down over 2025. When interest rates come down, stock prices tend to go up because the present value of their future earnings gets discounted at a lower rate. So as interest rates come down, you can expect the stock market to go up. Another macro factor that's being included in this is increased labor productivity. A lot of that is based on AI and the improvements in AI and the efficiencies that we could be expected to see in 2025 could play out through higher productivity and therefore higher corporate profits, higher stock market. As we've seen many times in this channel, higher earnings per share for companies tends to lead to a higher stock market. And if these earnings continue to grow, then you can expect the S&P 500 to grow as well. One other area that could help companies increase the profitability over the next year or so is expectation of a reduction in the corporate tax rate in the US. And this would feed through to higher earnings per share as well. Question remains is, can that be done in 2025? I'm not so sure. A couple of other market trends that have led to these optimistic views and forecasts for 2025 for the S&P 500. Increased market breadth. What do we mean by this? This just means that the stocks outside of the top 7, or the magnificent 7 as the media likes to refer to them, the remaining 493, a broadening out of gains for them. So there's an expectation that the market will broaden out and some of the increases in share prices will filter through on the remaining 493. The market concentration is the highest it's been in 100 years. We've seen that in my recent video, Goldman Sachs report. But if this broadens out, you can expect the S&P 500 to increase. Another reason, kind of based on the political changes that we've seen in the US, an increase in expectation for mergers and acquisitions. If deregulation happens and regulations come down, you can expect more companies acquiring other companies. And that leads to higher valuations and more activity overall. So we may see increase in M&A that feeds through to stock prices. But keep in mind, when it comes to predicting the S&P 500 or any stock market for that matter, it can be very unpredictable and very difficult to do. In fact, the market this year for 2024 has totally outperformed a lot of the banks' forecasts for 2024. It's very unpredictable and difficult to do. So a lot of the banks I just mentioned, their forecasts for 2024 were not very accurate actually. The market outperformed. I mentioned Ed Yardetti research a moment ago, someone that I like to watch and see, probably because he tends to be quite optimistic, and that tends to be correct. But one forecast that he's put in a little bit longer than 2025, but going out to 2029, he actually forecast a compound annual rate of 16%. That would take the S&P 500 up to 10,000 by 2029. Incredibly bullish forecast, completely different than what we saw with the Goldman Sachs awful stock market forecast just a few weeks ago. I put a link to that video in the description so you can have a look at that as well. But a 16% annual return between now and 2029, incredibly bullish, very interesting forecast, one that I might do a video on in the future as well. So what does this mean for you? Well, really, this is just a case of riding the momentum. As you know on this channel, I've been a big proponent of index funds and ETFs, particularly in the S&P 500 for your portfolio. And you should have a high level investment in there. But as I mentioned earlier, if we think that the market is going to broaden out and the breadth is going to return and the 493 stocks outside of the Magnificent 7 are going to see some returns, you may want to consider an equal weight ETF. But overall, a long-term investment in something like the S&P 500 should reward you handsomely. 16% is extremely optimistic. Don't know if we'll get there, but let's see what happens in 2025. So what do I think is going to happen in 2025? Well, I tend to be optimistic when it comes to this, but not quite as optimistic as some of those banks have forecasted. I actually wouldn't be surprised if we see somewhere in between a 7, 8, maybe a 9% increase for the S&P, but I probably would say some point in 2025 we're going to see a 5, perhaps even a 10% sell-off. Wouldn't surprise me, and we're probably due for that, and in fact I think that's pretty healthy for the market. But by this time next year, I wouldn't be surprised if overall the market is up around 8% from where it begins on January 1st, 2025. Overall, like I said, don't pay too much attention to the forecast. Don't make too many adjustments to your portfolio just based on these forecasts alone. You want to always be thinking long-term with your investments, like I've always said. That's what I'll continue to do, irregardless of the forecast that we've just discussed for the next year for 2025. But what do you think? Where do you think the market is headed for 2025? What is your prediction? Leave me a comment. Tell me the number. Just put in the S&P 500 level that you think in 1 year from time. And if you want, give me a little explanation as to why you think so. Perhaps you turn out to be right. We can look back in 12 months from now and just see where you finished up versus the market and who was the closest to predicting the closing level for the S&P 500 in 2025. Well, that's my video on the forecast for 2025 for the S&P 500. Overall, pretty bullish, I would say, based on the momentum that we've seen. But will we see a 19% increase like Ed Yardetti predicted? Well, let's wait and find out. If you like the video, please give me a thumbs up on it. Comment, like I said, on where you think the market will go. Share it with a friend and subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. Get more great videos like this, and I'll see you in the next video. All the best in your savings and investment journey.